got some time to stay. Hey, 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 and everything's okay. It's a sunny day, we got some time to stay. Hey, 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 and everything's okay. Cuts and the rain's gone, we gotta have a lot of fun. All I serve you got a smiling face for everyone. Life can be so beautiful when you stop your judging. You'll just be free.
Hey everybody, I bet you're wondering about our new little intro. Well, I am Sunny Shell, and I'm really excited because this is a very special show. We've been doing a lot of growing, changing, and improving, not only with our channel, but also with my show. So today I am so happy to welcome you not to the Crucible on the Promethean secular frontier, but instead to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven, where we discuss science, philosophy, and reason from a secular perspective. And in the coming weeks, I am super excited to be able to share more with you about these changes. So be looking out for that. But let's get on to tonight's show. So tonight, we're going to be discussing the history of Roe versus Wade, white Christian nationalism, and how we ended up where we are now with women's rights. And I have an amazing person that I want to introduce to you guys. She's been on before. I want to introduce to you Lauren Turek. Hey, Lauren.
Hi, how are you?
I am doing great. I appreciate you coming on and for our inaugural show of the Sunny Spot.
I'm really excited to be here to chat with you about this topic.
I am too. So in the background, we started talking and it's like we have a lot to talk about on this topic.
We do.
So the first thing I really wanted to do was to kind of get a little bit of historical perspective. I mean, there's been a lot of people, a lot of different shows that have been talking about the abortion issue and women's rights and bodily autonomy, but we're going to take a little bit of a different track on this. We're really wanting to talk about the historical and political undertones or underpinnings of what we're seeing today. So the first thing I want us to get to is kind of the history of Roe v. Wade. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. Which aspects do you want to chat about with that?
Well, let's talk. One thing we were talking about behind the scenes was that a lot of people feel that Roe v. Wade, it passed or it went through the Supreme Court. The decision was made in 1973. And a lot of people, like you had said before, think that right after that, day one after that went through, that the evangelical right just started picking up their pitchforks and fighting and working to try to get Roe v. Wade overturned, and that is not the case.
That's right.
So let's start there.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really helpful to keep in mind is that for decades before Roe v. Wade, if we think about which religious groups were most active in fighting against abortion rights, even though you might think, oh gosh, the religious right, well, there wasn't the religious right as we know it today in place. The groups that were fighting most vociferously against abortion in the 1950s were Catholic groups. So it was predominantly a Catholic movement. And so evangelicals, Protestants in general, but evangelicals and fundamentalists, so, politically conservative Protestants were initially not on board with them because there's this long history of antipathy between Protestants and Catholics. They saw it as a Protestant issue. In fact, in the early 70s, if you looked at what the Southern Baptists were saying, many Southern Baptists, who we think of now as being real sort of key players in the religious right, they were very accepting of Roe v. Wade. They, in general, were, not all of them, but many sort of felt like, while they didn't want what they called, quote, abortion on demand, although we can quibble with that term, they favored women's rights to make a decision about that for themselves, particularly in cases where there was a risk to the mother's life. So this is not a group that was immediately galvanized by this issue. In fact, it took quite a long time before evangelicals became the fighting force against abortion that we think of today, where they're such stalwarts on this issue. And it was a really coordinated effort to get them pulled into that. And so what we start to see is that there's this constellation of other issues that leaders within the Republican Party and among religious conservative leaders, that they started to harp on, that started to pull evangelicals in. And a lot of this had to do with notions of pushing for a perspective of family values, to push against an idea of secular humanism, and to push for a perspective on religious freedom or religious liberty. And so those three kind of buzzwords were pieces of this larger puzzle that pulled in antipathy towards LGBTQ people, for example, or concern about prayer in school and people seeking to ban reading the Bible, or the change in tax exemptions that some segregationist schools were benefiting from. So there's a whole bunch of issues that get pulled in. And so it's not really until the late 1970s that evangelicals are really a key force in the anti-abortion movement, working to try to undermine and later overturn Roe v. Wade.
And yeah, that's very interesting, because the way that the evangelical, that just regular people in the evangelical Christian religion feel is that, it's like they can't even remember that. Even the older ones, it's like they don't remember that time, because it's like, no, every life is sacred, and a life begins at conception and all of this stuff. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, if you go pretty far back in history, like the early 1900s, it was commonplace for women to take medicines to get rid of, or what they consider, holistic medicines, in a sense, to try to control their periods or control conception, and even to get rid of an unwanted pregnancy. And that it wasn't considered something that was against their religion. I mean, there were people who had different views on it, of course. That's always been the case.
Even around the time of the founding, abortion, before quickening, wasn't illegal.
Right, before quickening, exactly. And quickening is really when you start feeling the baby kick and those little hiccups that you feel in your stomach when you're pregnant. That's we're talking probably 18 to 20 weeks is what we're talking about.
Quite a ways into it, absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. And
I mean,
so
the
that's
very idea, and also the very idea of life starting at the moment of conception. That again, that was a Catholic idea, not one that Protestants accepted for a very long time. So to hear that now, it's a recent development, a relatively recent development for Protestants to have that particular perspective.
Right. And even the Jewish perspective also. And I think even now the Jewish perspective is with first breath, isn't it?
For many, yes. And also the idea that it is the woman's life first that should be considered. And so, you don't want to be forcing her to make a decision that would put her life at risk in favor of a potential life.
Right. And I think one of the things that just brings into mind some of the things that I've been hearing now is things like a particular state legislator standing up and saying something about ectopic pregnancies, like, but wait a minute, that child, are we saying that child doesn't deserve to live just because it's an ectopic pregnancy? It's like, that embryo is not going to survive anyway.
There's
just
no
now
way.
We're talking about the life of the mom completely.
Truly,
So
that senator or representative made some incredibly specious argument that, well, you could take it out and implant it in the womb. It's like, no, that's just not how the body works. That is not a viable pregnancy, and in fact, it literally endangers the life of the mother. I mean, I think almost in all cases, it's incredibly dangerous.
Yes, in all cases. There is no such thing as a woman surviving from that.
No.
Yeah, so okay, so that again is what we've been talking. You've heard a lot of arguments with that, but when you think about this direct marriage with evangelical and Republican power kind of mixing and becoming one, people have also demonized science along the way. And so then that opens up the door for those type of things where people say things that are absolutely ridiculous and put people in direct harm. I mean, it's like really a life and death issue that we're talking about.
Yeah, truly a lack of understanding about how the female reproductive system works. I mean, it's very clear. that
Yeah,
many of these
absolutely.
legislators just simply don't understand and don't want to.
Exactly. So back to out of what's going on today and back to kind of the history. There's also another part of this that I really want to get into, and that's the Christian nationalist and the racial kind of components that go into this. And I really want to dive into that because I don't think a lot of people really know some of this history of how the anti-abortion movement is really there's a more sinister thing behind it than caring about the lives of the unborn at all.
There's this, I think so much of this goes back to where did the religious right come from? Because again, right now, the key issue that we think of the religious right pushing for is this anti-abortion move. But when we think of the emergence of the religious right, there are a number of factors that bled into it, and race is part of this. So if we think back to the civil rights era, remembering another really significant Supreme Court case, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education. And after the Brown decision comes down, an enormous number of Southern senators and representatives signed what was known as the Southern Manifesto, where they essentially said that they were going to resist, by all, quote, legal means, implementing Brown versus Board. And they did this in a variety of ways. So, and we're talking, again, a lot of Southern Democrats at the time, very resistant to integration. And they were doing things like closing public schools in order to avoid integrating them. And some of these states closed public schools for, in some cases, for years to avoid having to move forward with integration. And in other cases, in some of these states, what happened were that they would open what were known as segregation academies, and these were private and typically Christian schools where white families would send their children so they would not have to deal with integration. Okay, so that's one piece of this. And this becomes an issue later on in the 1960s and early 1970s as we come to that point where Brown really has to be implemented. Like, it has to have been put in place, right? All deliberate speed has happened. So they're actually trying to move forward with this. And there's another key court case that folks need to know, which is what eventually becomes Green versus Connolly. And this is a case that is about the tax-exempt status of many of these schools that were segregated. And this is a particular issue for a particular college, which is Bob Jones University. And the IRS starts to go after some of these schools that are discriminating against Black students. And even though Bob Jones made these kind of nominal attempts to, quote, integrate, initially they admitted one Black student, but he didn't stay for very long. And then they said, well, we'll admit Black students if they're married to each other because they were worried about miscegenation. But it's very clear that they're not really sort of abiding by the spirit of Brown versus Board and of integration. And so the IRS moved to strip their tax exemptions. So this is a particular issue that the sort of architects, the early architects of the religious right seize on. They, folks like Paul Weyrich and Francis Schaeffer, are attempting to build political power for the Republican Party. So another piece of this puzzle is that as the Democratic Party nationally starts to move into supporting the civil rights movement, Kennedy, for example, pushing for a Civil Rights Act that we see civil rights legislation going forward in 64 and a Voting Rights Act in 65 under Johnson. There is this exodus, sort of a revolt in some ways from the Southern Democrats, and we see a shift to supporting Republican leadership in the South. It's this it doesn't happen overnight, but it is this change that happens as former Southern Democrats start to look a different way. And they were conservative. I think sometimes we think with our very polarized politics now that, well, Democrats were always liberal and Republicans were always conservative, but there actually used to be liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. So there was much more kind of this action happening, just kind of crossover. So they were conservative Democrats. They start to become conservative Republicans. And in this, there's this movement across the South and into the Southwest where white evangelicals, white fundamentalists are moving away from Democrats. They're kind of coming into the Republican orbit. And these sort of architects of the religious right, again, like Francis Schaeffer and Paul Ryrick, see this as an opportunity in order to, because evangelicals weren't a reliable voting bloc for the Republicans yet, and they figured if they could get them to become a reliable voting bloc, the Republican Party itself could become this really powerful force, and that evangelicals could become a really powerful force within that, and fundamentalists as well. And Green versus Connolly is one issue where they're able to really rally a lot of that. They also rally these groups on issues like another Supreme Court ruling, Engel v. Vital, was in 1962. It was about school prayer. They get people riled up about rulings against reading the Bible in school. But all of these pieces fit together. So evangelicals, by the late 60s, feel that they're under siege in a way. They feel that their cultural values are under attack, and those cultural values are linked in some cases to their perspective on race, right? They feel affronted by the civil rights movement and the changes that the civil rights movement is pushing for. They're affronted by the idea of not being the dominant faith in a particular area. They're affronted by the rise of the feminist movement. They're affronted by the gay rights movement. And all of these things are starting to come to the fore, especially by the late 1960s, and they are just pushing back hard. And so this is a way to mobilize them. So abortion, in other words, is not the one driving force that brings us the religious right. It's this constellation of other factors as well. So it's one, but not the only one. And a reaction against the civil rights movement and against many of the victories of the civil rights movement is another piece of it.
Absolutely. I want to touch back on something that you said really quickly, because I think people need to understand this. I've heard two separate things. That one, the Democrats have always been left and the Republicans have always been right, which we know is not true. I've also heard that the Democrats were once the Republicans of the from before, and the Republicans were the Democrats of before, like the parties switched places. Their name stayed the same, but the party switched. And what's actually the case is that, so the United States, our political spectrum is very different from the rest of the world. Most of the world centers here, and you have all these different parties along the line on each side. Ours is, the center is very much to, and I can't tell which one I'm on the screen because it's different from mine, but very much to the right. We are center right in our center of everybody else. So we are already a little more conservative than everyone else, generally speaking, except for looking at some of those theocratic countries.
Yeah.
And then it was a very, like you said, like this, it was a basket weave, because it was not, people did not vote based on their party. They may have registered as a Republican or Democrat, but they would vote to the left on this issue and to the right on this issue. And it was very much this weird kind of thing like
and
this.
It's regional. I mean, what Northern Democrats are after in, say, the early 20th century is different from what Southern Democrats want, but they're both in the Democratic Party. I mean, this is one of the reasons why during the New Deal era, Franklin Roosevelt is working very hard to get a handle on getting this enormous coalition together of groups that would not ordinarily have voted together. The Northern businessmen, folks in the South, African Americans who were explicitly left out of New Deal programs because Roosevelt was trying to hold on to the Southern Democratic vote. I mean, these tensions did not emerge in the 60s. There are tensions between Democrats back that early. I mean, they're furious with Truman when he desegregates the military. I mean, there are these tensions within the Democratic Party that reflect that wide range of views that existed at the time. And and again, that's not to say that the North wasn't also racist. Like, absolutely was. Segregation is not just an issue in the South, and it's sort of throughout. But the Southern Democrats had a real stranglehold at certain points on the direction of the party.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then you see, like you were talking about, during the '60s, the late '50s, and all throughout the '60s, we had all of this kind of social political turmoil, and it helped to solidify. There was that group that was like, "Wait a minute, this is way too much, too fast." And I mean, I can understand that feeling, that fear that arises when you have things, especially coming out of the '50s, where the family was very nuclear and you're recovering from World War II, and men are coming back, from the war, and they're now getting back to that nuclear family. But you had this underpinning of angst from women because they had been in the workforce during the '40s, the '30s and '40s, and all of a sudden they're pushed back into the kitchen.
It's also so interesting to even think of the idea of a nuclear family, because that is not an old, that is very much a sort of outcome of the 1940s and 50s. If we think earlier on, people used to live with their extended family. They would live in these urban enclaves, particularly if we think of immigrant communities coming over, living with several generations in the same household. It is after the war we start to see this atomization in a way, where families are moving to live in one single family house, just mother, father, children, that you get this ideal of the nuclear family. And so much of this also, I think, relates to changes in the Cold War, this idea that, well, in the Soviet system, they have, they've separated out the family, right? Children are being raised in a more communal way, and women are going to work. But look at us here in the United States, and it starts to elevate this idea of the nuclear family as something particularly American, and anything else as communist. And that sort of claiming anything you don't like as communist, we see that. I'm sure everybody has seen the images of people protesting against integration, holding up signs that say, quote, race mixing is communism, the signs that say, oh, Martin Luther King Jr. was a communist. I mean, they just use it to tar anyone and anything they don't like. But it's linked to that. I mean, they link the idea of this nuclear family to this ideal, and the architects of the religious right seize on that. They use the language of family values, the idea that there is one family norm that is the core of what it means to be an American and what it means to have these values. And it's so effective at bringing women into the fold, what we might think of as being against their larger interests in terms of their bodily autonomy. And Catholic activists were very good at this, right? Phyllis Schlafly famously brought on this idea that it was, that things like the Equal Rights Amendment or abortion were against women, and that we needed to protect women's special role as mothers, and that was the highest achievement that they could have, and that the Equal Rights Amendment and the feminist movement really threatened that special place that women held in the family, that protected status under the husband.
Right. It's so interesting because you also say, if you look at some of the interviews that she did with her husband, he would say things and you could see her bristle and then kind of get herself together and turn and look and smile at him and defer to him. It was a very interesting thing to see if you watch that. So she was even having to deal with the repercussions of what she was doing.
Because she was running to be an elected official. She was going to law school and raising 6 kids. But she would always say, well, the children are my biggest accomplishment. Mm-hmm. It's this very interesting kind of, as an outsider, you're like, boy, that feels like cognitive dissonance. But of course, for her, it's not, right? That is her worldview.
Right.
That she holds. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And that's how you can start to see, as we talk about these things, you start to see where the abortion issue starts to, the seeds are planted in each of these things with the feminist movement, but also with the civil rights movement, all of these things. And that sense of we're coming into this nuclear family and the roles of the genders, the very specific roles of the genders. And women are wearing these cute dresses and men are wearing these, these suits, and they come home, and even in our the media and ads, it's men come home and women have a smile on their face, and if they're not done right, they put them over their lap and smack their butt, and that kind of stuff. And then you go from that into the '60s, where everything gets kind of, all of that stuff that was simmering just kind of blows up, and these people are really they have a real sense of fear and living in that fear, but they also see an opportunity. I think the leaders of the evangelical movement, as well as the leaders in the conservative political movement, see an opportunity. And what I think is really brilliant of them, it's destructive for us, but it was brilliant of them to kind of like if you are going to go into investing, you invest for the long term.
Yes, yeah.
You know, and that's what they were doing. They were investing in the long term and even giving up certain battles because they were looking for what is happening today.
I mean, that is what I think, looking at it now, one of the things that is most frustrating is that they just stayed on these issues and never wavered. Whereas when we look at many of like the feminist movement, they had made this great progress in terms of pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, and they had, you know, they were so close to getting it ratified, and they almost, you know, it's as though they kind of lost some momentum, or they really felt like it was set and in the bag and they could turn to other things. And that's when we see these anti-feminists swoop in and fan out with their activism. You know, there's this tendency to think, well, Roe won't be overturned, so maybe we don't need to be out mobilizing. They were always out mobilized. They were always in the streets protesting. You know, you need to have that same energy. You have to match that energy because, yeah, they seem to have played the long game, and to our detriment, right? We need to have more of that kind of fire to fight that.
Yeah.
It's frustrating when I teach the 70s, and I'm like, oh my goodness, you guys thought you had it in the bag, and we didn't.
Yeah, we thought. I mean, you know, I was born in the 70s, and so you know, when I came of age in the 80s, women were really kind of finding themselves, but it was in this weird conservative environment as well.
Yeah.
So in order for women to feel like we were really making it, we had to have, you know, shoulder pads up to here. And our hair is, you know, the higher the hair, the closer to God. You know, I couldn't tell you how many times I heard that. So we were trying to find our way in this thing. And we're, you know, as we're going through all of that, those people in those two camps were doing some really underhanded things. And so we've talked about kind of the political stuff. I really want to get into the Christian nationalism stuff now. How does, you know, we've talked about these things. How does the Christian nationalism part come into play now?
Yeah, I think especially if we're thinking about the current era, when we think of Christian nationalists, there are folks that really sort of strongly associate or kind of in a way, they see the nation, they see the United States as completely entangled with their Christian identity. The two things cannot be separated. They believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. They believe that their particular interpretation of what Christian is should be the kind of essentially the law of the land, that they need to work to make the country look like what they want. And so they've got this, yes, particularly white Christian, right? We're talking about, white Christian nationalism. They're sort of rooted in that. And so this is, you know, we can look back to some of these folks in the 70s and before who are the kind of precursors. You know, they're sort of building this up, this idea up that these things are related. And it's a really powerful political tool. If you think that you are representing your nation, that your nation is, you know, under threat from people who want to take it away from what it's supposed to be, then it helps to explain, I think, why members of the Republican Party now have moved so far to the extreme right, but also why they see Democrats not as a legitimate opposition. They are fighting a different fight, right? They are not engaging in the, you know, tete-a-tete of politics where we're debating. They literally think that the Democratic Party is an illegitimate party, that the Democrats are not just un-American, but anti-American, that they are antichrist. I mean, it is apocalyptic, the language that they use. And this white Christian nationalism, this notion that they have, it feeds this sense that they're in a pitched battle. How do you compromise? How do you have political compromise if you really genuinely believe this idea that the Democratic Party, that they're, I don't know, eating babies or whatever, like absolute just nonsense they believe, but it's rooted in that, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. And at the same time, you have this movement basically saying, you know, painting Democrats in that light, or painting anything that goes against their agenda in that light. But then you have the Democratic Party or people on the left who are, big tent
Right.
thinkers, and like, well, we want to be inclusive, and we want to hear all viewpoints, and we want to be compassionate and understanding. um, and that actually ends up being an undermining thing, because it's like herding cats. I mean, and we start fighting among ourselves. Not well after Obama's election, when it starts getting to that point, then yes, it really started being some major infighting. But it wasn't before that. It wasn't necessarily fighting. It was just trying to figure out how we were going to work on things, and trying to allow in those more Democrat or what am I trying to say? Moderate Republicans that got pushed out, trying
Right.
to let them in, and trying to keep a hold of these people who seem to get further to the left, and trying to hold us all together. And those on the right were going, y'all just keep on doing that, because we have a secular focus, and we have the ability to be able to do that, to keep that by marrying religion into the political spectrum.
Yeah, they have this sort of very powerful party discipline and ideological discipline. It's I mean, they have this alignment that the Democrats are a big tent. They're bringing a lot of people together. They're not engaging in the same party discipline that the Republican Party is at this point. And you can look back. I mean, so much of this too. We look back to the 1990s, the contract with America, all of these efforts when the Republican Party sort of retook the House of Representatives and Congress, and they put forth this plan. They have just been chipping away and working towards achieving those goals. And we look back to that, and you can also see in that this, what we might think of as a Christian nationalist language, these ideas about what the nation means and whose nation it is, where even the idea of where rights come from. Mm-hmm. And so for many of them, they'll say, well, the rights don't come from the state, they come from God, which is a very particular kind of Christian, the way that they're framing it. It's their sense is that these are from their Christian God, and that, therefore we have to be looking to religion as we understand our rights, which is obviously not what other folks in the country would argue about where rights come from. And so there's plenty of folks who are arguing for, rights come from the state. It's a secular idea. This is an ongoing debate that we're seeing.
Right, exactly. It's quite fascinating. I mean, it's very frustrating, but it's also quite fascinating.
Yeah.
And I hear people say, well, we on the left need to fight just as dirty as the right does, but we don't have that mechanism to be able to get us all coalesced like they do. Because I mean, just if you look at the granular level, when I live in a very, very conservative area where it's 98% evangelical Trumpian Christians. And so if I even hint at anything that goes not radically different, just a little bit, if you talk about, well, yes, we have the Second Amendment, but maybe we need to just be careful of who gets these guns. Maybe we should just be looking at, then suddenly you're un-American. You're not just a little bit.
Yep.
You're un-American. And don't talking about abortion is like, wait, hold on. What are you talking about? You're going to kill babies? I mean, it doesn't even, you can't even entertain even a slight bit of a different viewpoint. You're either all in or you're out.
Well, and then of course the on the national level, one of the challenges is that we have this efforts from the media to, have this, what we have to have the kind of bipartisan. So even if what somebody on the right is saying is just fully outside of the realm of anything that's truthful, well, we have to give them equal time, and they have to, and we have to treat it as though it's a rational statement. And then we get these claims that, oh, the media is biased against the right. Meanwhile, they're showing very far right perspectives. CNN is never bringing on like far leftists. You'll never see. They're not going to bring on a tanky. They're not bringing on like Maoists. That doesn't happen. So with the idea that they're like giving too much voice to the left, it's not borne out in reality. I mean, when they have somebody from quote the left on, it is what we might really think of as maybe center left, but they will have the furthest right voices, and it gets amplified. And the idea that these are sort of equally rational perspectives that we have to give equal time to and equal platform to has, I think, magnified this. And then we see, there's the other, I think, piece of the story that's really important to think about here that relates to all of the topics we've been talking about is this sense of persecution that many on the right, and particularly the evangelical right, have cultivated since the 50s and 60s and 70s, where they see themselves as a persecuted minority, that in any sort of the fact that the country culturally has moved away from their values means that they are being oppressed, that the fact that gay people can marry, the fact that women have agitated for the rights that they've gained, the fact that you couldn't force people to have prayer in school or to read the Bible in school, that meant that they were being persecuted. And they really have held on to that sense that they are this besieged minority, and if they let anything go, that it'll be the kind of end of their religious freedom. And so they use this language of religious liberty and religious freedom in that way to rally themselves, to say, well, if we don't rally ourselves around this and defend all of these positions on the grounds of religious freedom, well, that'll be the end of Christianity. It's this, again, very black and white, very dire perspective. But that persecution complex is just rife within the movement.
Right, absolutely. But what I think is interesting, though, if you actually talk to even in my area, if you start talking to them at the beginning, they're all encompassing. There should be no abortion. There should just be no abortion at all. And then you say, well, what about if there's, you start chipping away at it. What if it's a case of incest? Well, then maybe in that case, but it needs to be documented. It needs to be investigated and adjudicated. We need to have direct proof that this happened. Well, that's honestly, from someone who works in these cases, even with incest, you very rarely get any direct, proof. 100%.
Well, this was like back in the 60s and 70s, when if you wanted to prove a rape, you had to have a corroborating witness.
Right.
Because that was that. I mean, it's of course they were not effectively prosecuted. When do you have that?
Right, and that came directly from the Bible.
Yeah.
That comes from the Bible, and you have Jehovah's Witnesses who still say that if there's any type of allegation, well, you have to have a witness, and if you don't, then and they're not willing to even follow the law because that's worldly, so this can go to the extreme if they, and I think that that's what's happening with the evangelical movement. You're starting to see it go from, I think, even away from, we talked about the evangelical leaders and the political leaders of the 50s and 60s kind of starting to formulate their plan. I think it's even gone beyond what they thought and going past their control. Even.
Well, what's so interesting is I brought up Francis Schaeffer earlier, and he was one of these early architects, along with his son, Frank Schaeffer, who now he was on CNN just last week.
Yeah.
Reminding everybody this is something he regrets. It has gone well beyond what he thought it would be, and he is now he's moved to the other side. But he was somebody who had pushed this anti-abortion crusade, and now really regrets what it has done to the country, because it has contributed in many ways to this extreme polarization that we're seeing, this sort of move to the right. And it's an asymmetric polarization because you have one side that has this kind of single issue that motivates them, and we just don't have that really on the other side.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right. We were talking earlier, I hate to kind of circle back, but I just thought of something. We were talking in this discussion about the civil rights movement and some of the racial things that occurred, that have not occurred, that have been central to this push, and not just the abortion issue, many other issues as well. But when we think about where we are now, and you think about the racial issues, the underpinnings of that with this movement, you had mentioned when we were talking before the show started about forced sterilization, and we talked about where this could lead. We know that there were forced sterilization in minority groups and also indigenous groups. I mean, that's come out now where not just forced sterilizations, but actually experiments where they did on women who came in thinking that they were getting some type of health care, and they were testing them to see how women would or these people would, because I don't think they really viewed them as humans, but how they would react or how their bodies would react, and how much they could take if they had no pain relief or anything to kind of just to stop the pain. But they would have forced abortions, they would have forced sterilizations, they had and other atrocious experiments done on their reproductive systems.
And they did experiments on enslaved women, obviously
Yes.
against their will. With absolutely no effort at pain management, because many doctors and the people experimenting believed that African Americans didn't feel pain or didn't feel pain the same way, which unfortunately is a perspective that has not gone away. There are many doctors and physicians now who believe, based on what they're taught in medical school, that people of color have different pain tolerances. One of my friends was denied adequate pain medication when she was pregnant or when she was giving birth because the doctor seemed to think that she had a different pain level because she was black. It's just, that's now, right? This hasn't got, so these ideas haven't gone away. And I think one of the other issues is that we think about with the sort of expected coming of overturning Roe v. Wade, the women that this affects is going to be, at least initially, predominantly women of color, poor women, who already have really, really poor maternal outcomes. They are much more likely to die in childbirth, much more likely to have higher infant mortality because of these, quite frankly, just the legacy of racist laws, racist policies that have been in place for a long time, and the legacies of them even after they're removed. And that's everything from, this could be a whole show, but talking about like the redlining of cities, which has led to people living in substandard housing and polluted areas that then have these cascading and compounding effects.
Absolutely. And when you think about then forcing them to give birth and removing any ability for them to even access, I mean, you think about it, a middle class even, or a wealthy white woman is going to be able to just go out of state or find another way to be able to get that abortion, even have access to doctors who will do it for them.
Being able to take a day off of work to go.
Exactly. I mean, I know from the work that I do, one of the hardest things that I see, and this is not just for minorities, but for lower income people all the way around, it's hard to get them to come for services that are free when they're 20 minutes away because they have cars that break down. There's not the proper infrastructure in the city. Like some cities don't have buses. I mean, we don't have a city bus. So you'd have to walk with 3 kids in tow around busy streets. It's hard to get to get access to what we would consider regular services, let alone anything, that's now being systematically and intentionally obstructed.
Well, and here in Texas, they estimated women from this area would need to drive something like 11 and a half hours to get to a state that offers abortion care. Many women, a significant number of women who need an abortion already have children. They are not in a position where they feel like they can have another.
And so what it means is then they're suddenly not able to work or they get fired from their job.
Exactly. And then they're trying to care for the children they have. It's a devastating situation for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And
there are so many complications. Pregnancy is not some cakewalk. It is a damaging, it's hard on the body, right?
Yes, it is.
And they're getting, if they can't, they may not have access to adequate medical care to have during the pregnancy, which could recognize problems to be treated. It's just, it's a nightmare scenario. Women are going to die. Women are already
Absolutely.
dying. We already have very poor outcomes for pregnant women throughout this country. It's going to get significantly worse.
You're right. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, especially when we start to see these situations where doctors are going to be concerned about, they're going to want to wait to make sure that it's a miscarriage, that it's an ectopic pregnancy, that there couldn't be any sort of challenge to their decision to help the woman in that situation. I mean, like helping a woman who's having a miscarriage, who's having an ectopic pregnancy, medically that is classified as an abortion. They're going to be dealing with these lawsuits, threats to their livelihood. Women are going to die.
Yeah, absolutely. You're exactly right. And it's not even, wait, hold on. My dog is starting to bark. I'm so sorry. Just speak amongst yourselves. He just.
He heard us all fired up, and
yeah, he just gets all excited, and who knows? There's no telling what it's about. But anyway, it's not just that the doctors are going to be concerned about that, but we were just talking about women who may not have access to regular health care.
Right.
What if she goes into the bathroom at work and has a miscarriage at work, and she's sitting there? She could bleed out right then. If she tries to get help, she could then be accused of doing something. We've already seen that. There have been women.
A woman in Texas.
Yes, yeah. being arrested and jailed for suspected abortive acts.
Something isn't I am not this kind of doctor, as my husband likes to remind me. But I think, isn't it 1 in 4 pregnancies naturally end in a miscarriage? And it is a huge number.
Especially first pregnancies, the first time that you get pregnant too. Yeah. So we're talking about younger women as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, that terror, and there have been other cases I know in Oklahoma and elsewhere where they've prosecuted women for, if you got in a physical altercation, it's your fault that the baby that the fetus died. Or if you were using drugs, you're held liable. I mean, these are incredibly dangerous precedents. I mean, it's
exactly.
Very frightening. And the thing is, once you remove again, this is a right that has been enshrined for 50 years. Taking away this right, it opens up the precedent to strike down a number of other rights based on privacy. And of course, the ones that we've been hearing about are, Obergefell, the sort of the right to marry, but that could also affect Loving v. Virginia, right? Interracial marriage. Right to privacy could affect your right to contraception. But right to privacy is a kind of broad idea that could be applied to many other things that could affect not just women, but many other people as well. And so it's a scary time.
It's a slippery slope. I mean, the 14th Amendment is all about due process. That opens the door to a whole lot, and I don't think people are really realizing what
it's also very ironic that the Supreme Court justices are very worried about their right to privacy, to not have protesters peacefully holding a vigil outside their house while they are arguing that other people don't have any right to privacy over what they do with their private medical decisions with their doctors.
Exactly. I also think it's interesting that no one is arguing that we need to harvest a corpse's body for organs for a life.
No.
So a corpse now has more rights than
I said that to my mother. I said, dead people have more rights than I do.
It's scary. Just for me, I no longer have to face this issue, me personally. But I have a daughter, and I have daughters-in-law, and I have a grandchild. One of my grandchildren is a little girl. I see them. I see my friends. I see, this is an issue, and it's not just for me. Every man needs to be thinking about this too. Think about the women that you love, and but it goes so much bigger than just bodily autonomy and a woman's rights. We're talking about the fundamentals of what it means to actually be a free American. Right. I mean, we're now going into how do we define freedom? How do we define an American? What exactly is our constitutional rights. What does it mean to be a free person? I mean, all of these things are right now in question with this.
Absolutely. It's just, and then in thinking about, and again, it's a sort of a draft that we've looked at and that has been dissected in the media, but as a historian thinking and reading Alito writing that these were not sort of historically grounded rights is just, it's not true. Right?
Right.
The idea that abortion wasn't a thing at the time that the Constitution was written, it absolutely was, and it was legal until quickening. Right? This is not something that was made up in the 1960s. Right? This is something that had in fact been around, and he just glosses over that and looks for legal precedent to some really truly foul individuals like Hale, who are, I won't even go into it. Just really, I mean, really sort of, you would not want to put yourself on the same side of them if you were being very opaque about what their beliefs were.
Right, exactly. Earlier I saw a question. I just want to get in it really quickly because I know we're, and there might be others. If any of you in the chat would like to ask questions of our guests, please do. But I'm going to show this one really quickly. So this was a question earlier. Is there any historical secular natural law arguments that were or are anti-abortion at any stage? I can't find one that doesn't include a religious definition. That's really a good one. I hadn't read it before I posted it. So the way I'm understanding it is, are seculars or leftist or any of those also fighting? Is there an anti-abortion argument that isn't rooted in religion?
That's a great question. I'm not a law scholar. I'm a historian of politics and policy, foreign policy. So I can't comment on the natural law question. I think it's a really good one, though. I know colloquially from my own experience that I have not seen a lot of ideas from secular sources that would be against it. I mean, when I think of the kind of natural law ideas and thinking about the foundations of some of our ideas about where freedom comes from and where our rights come from, the very idea of rights, those that are rooted in secular beliefs really do seem to put an emphasis on that personal freedom, that liberty that we have. And it would seem from there that something like this that takes away your liberty would be a problem, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. I agree. I can't think. I mean, I that's outside of my wheelhouse as well. But if you think about it, if you're looking at law, legislation and rights and those type of things, if you don't bring religion into it, then you're looking at it from a little bit of a broader perspective. Just like we're talking about it, all the other things what does this mean? If we say this, what are the end results of that? How does that also encompass other things? We kind of look from a broader perspective.
But even thinking I think sometimes we're using religion as a shorthand for Christianity because other religions don't have the same perspective on abortion that Christianity does.
Right. Absolutely. That's an excellent point. In fact, as we were talking with Judaism,
right.
It's mostly at the first breath, although I'm sure that there's some, when you talk about an individual's perspective, there are secular people who also are anti-abortion.
Right.
That doesn't, just not believing in a God that's it. That's all that says about you. It doesn't say anything else. But if you look at law and policy and that sort of thing, and you don't bring religion into it, I think that's the thing that we're talking about, the dividing line that we're talking about.
Well, and I think one of the reasons I think this is so challenging as a policy issue is that the idea, when does life begin? There isn't a right answer to that. That is a philosophical argument. And so the question to me is, should we be making a law based on a theological perspective on that question, a theological perspective that is not shared by all religions and non-religion, but is simply one of many? And of course, I would say no. I don't think we should be making a decision in law based on a theological perspective that is held by some people in the country, but not everybody. And we don't yet live in a theocracy. So
Yeah, I will say I have always thought up until recently that we would not, we have enough safeguards in place that we would never go that route. I think that we have seen especially since Trump was elected. I think that Trump is just a symptom. I mean, honestly, because he's not smart enough to get where he got. There's political threads that were already pulling at him. He said he was going to run one other time, another time.
He was useful
Yeah, he was a
to the
useful
people who
tool.
wanted him in power. Yeah.
Exactly, and he was very useful. Through him, they were able to see just how far they could push things and move goalposts and take things that were considered norms, you know, social norms, political norms, even legislative norms
Yeah.
that no one even thought would ever be touched. So why codify it into law? It's just no one's ever going to go there. And he went there and they all came right along with him. And from that, we're now seeing, I mean, for instance, right before he came in, you saw that Obama's Supreme Court nomination was wrongfully denied.
Hmm.
And there was nothing that they could do to fight against it because they had a minority in Congress.
And the second that the Republicans were in power and had openings, they had no compunction about rushing somebody in a few weeks before an election, despite all of the frippery about, we have a lame duck and we need to wait and see.
Absolutely. And not just on the Supreme Court, although I think that was like the candy on the top. But they put in hundreds of judges all across the country in lower courts to ensure that these things would have a hard. It's like
deeply unqualified often.
Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. And that way it would make its way up to the Supreme Court rather quickly.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
And I think one of the things that has been frustrating in sort of observing the Democratic Party since the late 90s really is the lack of attention to anything other than that presidential level or the sort of federal level elections. It needs to be a focus on the courts. There needs to be a focus on state houses, state senates, school board elections. I mean, it's all of that lower level stuff that people don't, are not paying adequate attention to, where decisions. I mean, so much. This is a little bit off topic, but there are coordinated efforts to put in place people from the far right into school boards, and they're pushing. Again, so much of it is based on this fear mongering about cultural change, right? So fear mongering about critical race theory, what they're calling that, which they're using as a smokescreen to attack teaching the history of race in this country, or sort of the desirability of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. But it's a coordinated effort. And that goes back to the kind of, it's just they're always, the right is mobilized and they are active, and they're active from the lowest level because they know that it matters. So there needs to be, in order for the center and the left to have any hope of countering it, they need to be just as active and motivated from the lowest level up. And we're starting to see some of that. There have been more judges nominated, but it has to be that long-term commitment, long-term goal, not sporadic and just at the time of the presidential elections.
Right. But I do want to reiterate what we talked about earlier. The biggest problem that the left faces, and I don't mean the left like,
not the tankies.
No, yeah, we're not talking about that. We're talking about anything from a moderate Republican over.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly. And that's right. That right there is the problem. We don't have a unifying thing that gets us all together like the evangelical Christian movement does, because they have not just the political leaders. That's not even nearly enough. It's the pulpit, the preachers in the churches who are standing there and saying, in order to be a good Christian, you must vote this way, which goes against our laws.
Well, it absolutely does. And I think one of the things, when we think about the founders, the concern that people like Jefferson and others had about the separation of church and state, it was not just one way. It was not just a concern about religion affecting the state politics. it was also about the ways that engagement with the state can hurt your faith, right? Can hurt your
Absolutely.
religion. And so they seem to have forgotten that. I mean, another piece of this that I think we need to think about in terms of, it is also frustrating that the right has managed to kind of corner the debate about corner the definition of what is an American and who gets to be an American. And I think that is somewhere where we should not be letting them. We should not have to be on the defensive every time about that. One of my very favorite speeches that I play for students is the speech that Lyndon Johnson gave when he signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and he hearkened back to the founding, and he said, ever since that first generation of Americans pledged their, they pledged their life, their liberty, their sacred honor, whatever, I don't have the exact quote, the effort has been to expand the circle of liberty, of who is included in that circle of liberty, who gets to benefit from the rights and privileges of being an American, who gets to define what that is. And to me, that is the most both historically attentive and realistic and hopeful appraisal. Look, things they have never lived up to the highest ideals, right? But if you're working to it, you can ever expand who gets to be part of those ideals. You can get ever closer to living up to and embodying those ideals. That should be what we should be arguing for, right? That this is that being aware of our history, being cognizant of these things, that's what makes you a strong American. If the only way that you feel, for example, a child might feel good about their country is if they're lied to about what happened, you're not a patriot. That's not patriotic.
Right.
That's depressing, right? If, on the other hand, you can say to yourself, boy, some of these ideals are great. Some of these people who made them did awful things. We need to keep working to expand the circle of liberty to make sure that everyone has these rights. And so I think, and I realize we've strayed a bit from the broad topic, but this is related. This is about
Absolutely.
the 14th Amendment and who has a right to bodily autonomy, who has a right to enjoy the full benefits of citizenship in this country. That's what we should be fighting for. And I think we need to redefine the terms of that debate and sort of take back from these folks the sense that, of course, they're the true Americans, or that people only in certain parts of the countries are real, that the middle of the country is real America. That's a ridiculous idea.
It is, but what you just said was extremely important, because that could very well be the unifying theme that finally gets the left, or even moderate Republicans that have been pushed out of their party together. And that is, what does it mean to be an American, and where do we draw that line of what it means to be free, to be included, to have rights? I mean, that is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that now we're seeing people who are going to be like, wait a minute, I have never voted in the midterm elections or on those, we have these little local things that pop up here and there that aren't on any schedule. And I've always just ignored them. The right never ignores them.
They are there.
Every time. They are also there volunteering and being, poll workers, and they're, doing all those things. This could be the unifying theme that gets people finally, okay, I've got to start being more active. I've got to get the polls. I've got to do these things, because just like that one, it's been passed around 100 times about, first they came for this group and then they came for this group.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're coming for me. Crap.
And there's no one to stand up for me. Right?
Exactly. I think that now we're starting to see that, because even though this is about women's rights, I think people are finally starting to see, wait a second, the tool that they're using, the very tool that they're using that they stated in that leaked report, was the 14th Amendment, and that has to do with so much more. And I think that was a big mistake. And I don't think it was leaked by the left, and that's a whole other topic.
Oh no, I definitely think it was leaked by the right. I mean, to ensure that nothing got changed, to ensure that the most extreme opinion was the one that came out. I think they're worried about, about John Roberts maybe tempering And now this is all speculation, but now maybe he can.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. So this is the thing. So what I want, we've already gone over, and there were some really great questions. I saw one of the questions went a little bit really far. We couldn't quite get to it. It had to do with Manafort and Russia.
Yeah.
And while I would love to talk about that, it really is too far afield. But what I do want to say to all of those who have been in the chat and who have been watching us, if you get nothing else from this, you may not even agree with us. You may believe that that it is morally justified to be anti-abortion, and you have a right to that viewpoint. But remember, this is just the beginning. This really is just the beginning. And once this comes out, we do not know where it can lead. And there's all kinds of speculation. So be aware of that. But for those of us who do believe in a woman's right to choose, we also believe in a man's right to choose. We believe in trans rights. We believe in, children's rights. We believe in inclusivity, and we understand what critical race theory actually is, which has nothing to do with what they're saying it does. There's so many aspects. So please become active. Please become active. Let this be the thing that gets you out. Register to vote and vote. No matter what, please vote. Do that. That is the single best thing that we can do, because we are so gerrymandered and things are so discombobulated that it's going to take a lot of us to overcome that. We have to have an actual blue wave. We have to do that. So please, everyone, be active. So Lauren, can you give us your final thoughts, just kind of wrapping it all up and putting a bow on it?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that I have learned most from teaching and studying history is that in the moment when decisions are made, it is unclear what the outcomes can be. And no matter what the folks in charge may be hoping for, more often than not, the consequences are far-reaching and unintended. So the decision that gets handed down, we don't know what's going to happen. I think many of us are anticipating what I suspect will happen. I don't know that the right fully grasps how many unintended consequences may come for them when this happens. And so I think, we're in a dangerous moment. Moment.
We absolutely are. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. You are fantastic. And I just totally geek out on this. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was a really fun conversation. And thank you to everybody who was debating and talking in the comments. It was great.
Yeah, it's very fun to watch that. So,
I see folks talking about Heather Richardson. Subscribe to her newsletter. I think Notes from American. It's amazing. She's an amazing historian.
Absolutely, very good. I will do that. I will absolutely do that. So thank you guys. For the rest of you, if you like this type of content and you're excited with some of the changes that are coming, again, be on the lookout. We have some really great things coming up. But like, subscribe, share, hit that bell. We do have our new Patreon account up, so take it out. Just look for Skeptic Haven. Look at all of our other social media accounts and join our Facebook, our Instagram, our Twitter, all those cool things that we have going on. Please do that, because we really need your help to kind of remotivate and rebuild, because we're really excited about that. I want to thank those behind the scenes, Wes, Josh, Phil, Kat, and Jena. You guys are fantastic. I just get to sit here and talk, which is something I'm really good at. They do all the hard work. Check out the other shows. We have Secular Soapbox, Women Atheist Unloaded, which I will see you on Saturday on that show. Sandbox Debates, One Good Reason, and The Bible Says What. And in the meantime, remember to always think critically. Good night, everybody.
It's a sunny day, we got some time to stay. Hey, 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 and everything's okay. It's a sunny day, we got some time to stay. Hey, hey, hey. rarer one. Life can be so beautiful when you stop be judging your